Okay, please can I welcome everyone to this meeting of, I'm going to move the script nearer because you can't move your head away from the microphone. Please can I welcome everyone to this meeting of Licensing and Regulation Committee, taking place in the Wharton Suite, Winchester Guildhall. The time is 6:31. My name is Councillor Hannah Williams and I am the chairperson of the committee. I have a few housekeeping points to make before we begin. Can I please advise that the open parts of the meeting are being audio recorded and live streamed from the Council's website. In addition, there is a video recording of the meeting which is being made and will be made publicly available shortly afterwards. Please can I remind all participants to speak clearly and remember to use your microphones. In addition, can you please speak directly into the microphone and do not turn away whilst speaking. This will ensure that your comments are picked up for audio and video recording, as well as improving the audibility in the room. I know it's quite, you people want to turn to look at the person they're talking to. Unfortunately, you just have to stare at your microphone. Please can everyone ensure that their mobile phones and other electronic devices are on silent or switched off entirely. In the unlikely event that it is necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow any instructions given to you by staff or fire marshals. All fire exits are marked by the green exit signs, and please proceed quickly and calmly to the assembly point, which is in the Abbey Gardens. Do not use the lift. Welcome to everyone present. Right, turning to the agenda, apologies. So we have apologies from councillors Cunningham, Isaacs, Reach and Small, and also Atchwell. Disclosures of interest.
Oh, Chair, sorry to interrupt. Can I just announce that councillors Pearson and Mead are deputising for councillors Cunningham and Isaacs.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so disclosures of interest. Does anyone have any declarations for anything that's happening this evening? Okay. Right, appointment of the vice chairperson. Are there any nominations for the vice chair?
Yes, Chair. I'd like to nominate Councillor Laming.
Okay, I will second that. And on the other side, do we have any?
Councillor McLean.
Councillor McLean. And do you have a seconder for that? Councillor Pearson, thank you. Right, therefore, as another name has been put forward and seconded, we need to take that to the vote. So can all those in favour of Councillor Laming please raise their hands? You got that, Nancy? Thank you. And can all those in favour of Councillor McLean please raise their hands? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. That was 4 votes in favour of Councillor McLean and 3 votes in favour of Councillor Laming. So Councillor McLean will be appointed as the Vice Chair. Thank you.
Going to stay there for tonight? Okay, that's all right. All right then, moving on to agenda item number 4. Minutes of the previous meeting held on the 10th of March 2022. Has everybody received and looked at these minutes? And are we agreed that they are correct and accurate record? Agreed? Okay, fine. Okay, number 5, public participation. So we have nobody has put their name down for public participation. So we will move on to item number 6, which is the taxi review policy LR 560. And Bryony Appletree will introduce it for us. So obviously, as it, to note that the recommendations we're looking at today are on page 7 of the agenda pack. Okay, Bryony.
Thank you, Chair. And I apologise if I sound a little nasal. I do have a bit of a cold. So the review of the taxi policy and these 3 attached conditions. So in July 2020, the Department for Transport published the Statutory Taxi and Private Hire Vehicle Standards. This is a government guidance document which focuses on establishing common core minimum standards across the taxi and private hire sector. It also aims to improve the protection of children and vulnerable adults when using taxi and private hire services. The government's expectation is that all licensing authorities adopt these standards, except where there are compelling local reasons not to do so. So you may remember in 2020, the Council underwent a review of its taxi policy to implement new requirements for maximum vehicle age, emission standards and vehicle signage. And it was at that time that we decided to maintain a focus on vehicle standards, despite the Department for Transport guidance having been published, more so that we could split the project in half, really, for resourcing purposes. Being able to do that this year, we've been able to look at the Department for Transport standards. So the DFT recommend that licensing authorities publish a consideration of the statutory standards and how they intend to implement them. This was written and published on the Council's website in January 2022, and it's actually at page 79 of your reports pack. The licensing authority has proposed changes to its statement of licensing policy with respect to driver, vehicle and operator licenses, and then also the 3 separate sets of conditions that apply to each of those types of licenses. And these proposals are to align ourselves with the Department for Transport's recommendations. For the draft documents, if you'd like to take note, the policy can be found starting at page 23, and the conditions can be found at pages 57, 63 and 73 respectively. All of the changes are shown tracked. Broadly speaking, the proposed changes fall into the following subheadings. So we've got criminal records checks, disclosure of information, display of information in licensed vehicles, local authority decision making and operator record keeping and policies. There are a couple of additional changes that don't fall within the subheadings. They've just been made to ensure consistency with the Council's corporate style, to simplify language where we can, and to better explain a process for transparency reasons. So we've used this as a catch-all opportunity, really, to update our policy. A summary of all the changes can be found on pages 17 to 20 of your report bundle. In terms of the recommendations proposed, there are 2 that we are not proposing to implement, and I will just detail those for you now. One relates to the requirement for applicants and licence holders to submit a certificate of good character where they have spent at least 3 months overseas. In our experience, and also the experience of other neighbouring licensing authorities, it's very difficult to obtain a certificate of good character from another country or an embassy where the individual hasn't lived there for any more than 6 months. So we've actually rephrased it to 6 months rather than the recommended 3 months to minimise administrative burden on licence holders, and then they're not cheap, the certificates of good character, and if they apply for one and the request is rejected, they still lose their fee. We feel that 6 months is adequate. Additionally, the Department for Transport have recommended that we review whether CCTV in licensed vehicles is proportionate and necessary. We're not currently in a position to conduct a review. That's not saying we won't conduct a review, but at this time we're not in a position to do so. A project of this scale requires additional resourcing, which we don't have. We plan to undertake the project in 2023, assuming that our resources are sufficient to do so. So going back to the policy, a public consultation took place from the 14th of February to the 14th of March 2022, and a feedback questionnaire with links to the relevant draft documents were sent to all taxi and private hire licence holders and key stakeholders. That includes yourselves, all other members, parish councils, police, Hampshire County Council Adult and Child Services, and other organisations that represent children and vulnerable persons. We only received 7 responses to the consultation, but the majority of responses were in favour of the proposals. A summary of the responses is in section 7 of your report, so that's page 10 onwards. And a full report of the responses is at page 113. So our recommendations are that the committee here today agree the proposed amendments to the policy and the 3 sets of conditions, and then refer them for consideration by Cabinet. Before we get to any questions that the committee might have in relation to this policy and these conditions, at Councillor Williams' request, I'll just provide a quick update on some additional legislation that's actually come into force since the publication of this report, so we weren't able to take that into consideration at the time. So the Taxi and Private Hire Vehicles Safeguarding and Road Safety Act 2020, bit of a mouthful, came into effect on the 31st of May 2022. So this currently places a requirement on licensing authorities to report relevant information about taxi and private hire licence holders licensed by other authorities to those authorities. So to give you an example, if a licence holder is licensed by Winchester but also licensed by Southampton, and it comes to Winchester's attention that that person has a criminal conviction or other information that's relevant to safeguarding, then we would have a duty to notify Southampton. So councillors will be pleased to know that we already do this, so the legislation just makes it mandatory. And then the Taxi and Private Hire Vehicles Disabled Persons Act will take effect on the 28th of June 2022. It will amend the Equality Act 2010 and places some additional duties on us as a local authority, all things that we're doing already as well, which we'll be pleased to know. We'll be required to publish a list of all wheelchair accessible vehicles that we licence. We have this list, it's not currently published on the website, but could be published as soon as tomorrow. There's been a few changes to the exemption certificates that are granted to drivers who, by reason of medical condition, cannot accept people in wheelchairs. So we have to ensure that they have provision as well. The Equality Act, so a few minor changes there, and they have made it an offence for taxi and private hire drivers to refuse to accept carriage of any disabled person, which wasn't an offence before. All good stuff.
Councillor McLean, sorry.
We had it, I think it was the last meeting, we discussed complaints that had come in about people with guide dogs not being allowed access to certain vehicles. Is that now an offence under that piece of legislation that you've just read out? Disabled person access?
So that was already an offence under the Equality Act 2010. In relation to complaints previously received, we've not met the threshold for a prosecution, but it is something that we can deal with by means of our local policy.
We had a couple of complaints actually come in on that, didn't we?
We did, yes. So we're dealing with those, or rather we dealt with those by means of penalty points convictions in our enforcement policy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we'll be writing to all the taxi and private hire licence holders shortly to notify them of these additional pieces of legislation that have come into force, but ultimately not an awful lot changes for them, just to notify them really that it's happening. So going back to the policy and the conditions, we'll welcome any questions you might have about any of the draft documents. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to get it. Councillor Reid, I saw your hand first.
Oh, did you? All right. Just a very quickie. Some years ago, we had the situation that licenses were being issued by another authority, but their operation was in fact in Winchester. Has this now been, this particular problem been remedied? Changes in the rules?
As you remember from our committee meeting just before Christmas, we discussed this. Unfortunately, there is no new legislation to prevent this happening. However, the purpose of the Department of Transport Standards, which we've based our policy review on, that we're considering today, is to establish those common core minimum standards across the country, so that where a driver or operator is licensed in another authority, they're meeting the same standards in terms of public safety. Drivers can still be licensed elsewhere. A driver licensed in Yorkshire could work in Winchester. But by adopting these standards, and as the government have said that they expect all authorities to adopt these standards, we would I hope, be less concerned about a driver from another authority driving here because they're meeting the same standards. That help?
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Pearson.
Yes, I think it's about 6 months ago we had issues from one of the taxi drivers who had an electric vehicle, and the issue was a charging point. And I seem to recall he commented that the only charging point for taxis and private car was in Winchester Inn, which was way away from the normal pickup point to the station or outside the Guildhall. Has anything been done to resolve that issue?
So I'm going to pass over to David Ingram, which he was definitely expecting, because I know that he's been managing this case.
So you may be aware that we now have, I think it's in the region of 35 electric vehicle charging points across our car parking estate. So that includes Winchester and the White District. So we've got charge points in Bishop, Denmead, also in Alresford. The charge point that I believe the driver may be referring to, so I'm sort of filling in the gap because you haven't mentioned who the driver is, but you don't need to, is the rapid charger, which is up at Winchester Hotel in what is called the Coach Park. That particular charger, being a rapid, was a very expensive install. So effectively that's been installed at full cost to the company. So the company that paid for its install. So therefore they have control over its use and availability to market, if you like. We put that one in there specifically identified to serve the taxi trade because of its close proximity to the train station. But because we, as I say, because we didn't actually pay for it, we didn't have therefore any control over use it. We are looking to install a second rapid charger in that same location. So that's the work that's in play because it has been very successful. So MER are looking to fully fund. So, but the taxi trade have equal access to all the electric vehicle charge points within.
Thank you. So I noticed the point. At which page? Page 7. No, it wasn't 70. That's the show you was. There is something about low emission vehicles. There are only 37 chargers, all of the district, hardly encouraging these people having a taxi or private hire. Less so because they can charge at home. As taxis are tied more to Winchester town, to and from Winchester town, and of the 37, there seem to be too few for the number of taxis that we want to convert to electric within the town itself. Now, I believe we are still trying to encourage these people to convert to electric vehicles. Plus, of course, the need to qualify wheelchair users, which is additional expense. Very helpful to these, but indeed to taxi users.
Certainly take your point. As things stand within our taxi fleet, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bryony, we only have one electric vehicle taxi within our. So I speak for itself in terms of the uptake. The primary stumbling point, I believe, to the uptake of electric is the cost of the vehicle itself, rather than the availability of the chargers at this point in time. It's a very rapidly moving sector at the moment, so the conversation we have now will be probably very different in 5 years' time. So I can't predict what that's going to be, but you may be aware, Frank, of the sorry, Councillor Pearson, my apologies. Of the government's Road to Zero policy, which will require all new vehicles from 2030 onwards to be plug-in. So we're only 7 or 8 years away from that date. So I would expect a lot more electric vehicles and indeed electric taxis on our books next few years. But the main stumbling point is the cost of the vehicle. Our policy enables drivers to purchase an older electric vehicle, so the initial outlay will be less, and we are allowing them to drive that vehicle for a longer period, so they can drive that age.
The date of first licensing, an electric vehicle can actually be 8 years old,
Yep.
Whereas vehicles, if you like petrol diesel, have to be 5 years old or less, and then you can drive electric or hybrid vehicle until it is 15 years
That's
old,
right, yeah.
whereas it's 12 years for the rest of our vehicles.
We've got an energy conference coming up shortly. One of the exhibits on that is an electric bus. How are they going to handle? Sorry? The hydrogen, is it? Ah, I thought it was. Okay, withdraw the comment then.
I mean, I think I am also right, Mr. Ingram, in saying that I know that Hampshire are also doing work with electric chargers. I know that I've spoken with Councillor Warwick about it, and actually having more chargers installed, lamp posts and things like that. So looking at how, you know, charging points can be put in, not just for our taxi community, but for the general populace as well. And that obviously with government policy coming down, that's going to be a joint effort between district and county to actually ensure that we're going to be able to meet any kind of, you know, demand that we have to have as a result of government policies. That is something that has to come down. Councillor McLean.
Thank you again, Chair. We went to a meeting at Whiteley some time ago now, where the question was asked about putting power charging points in lamp standards, and then it was said it wasn't safe to do so because it would take out an awful lot of the substations if you started drawing too much power through them. Has there been a change there that we're aware of? That was a scientific chap was giving that view very strongly.
I think there's been a lot of concern over the National Grid's ability to service the perceived demand in electric vehicle charging across the country. I mean, it's a, dare I say, I think it's a bigger conversation than this committee. I know that there is a lot of work being done by the National Grid to ensure that there is sufficient supply to meet the demand. The charge points on lampposts are slow charges because then they don't have a sufficient supply for anything else. So slow being sort of 3 to 7 kilowatt hour. So that is what I would refer to as a trickle charge facility. So that means that the vehicle in effect has to be plugged in for a long period of time. A long period of time is sort of anything between 6 to 10 hours. So we're talking overnight charging only. You wouldn't plug into a lamp column for a quick 20-minute hit. It just wouldn't give you enough. So the whole delivery model of lamp column charges is for residents who do not have off-street parking, that they can basically a garage or a court that they can park a driveway where they would plug into their own property. So it literally come home at the end of the working day, plug in, don't get back in your car until 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock the next morning. I think there's a lot of questions. Resilience in the National Grid. They're confident, I understand they're confident they can meet them.
So I think we've got Councillor Reid and Councillor Kern, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this, but I'd also like to make sure that we actually go through all of the stuff that we've got here, the proposals in front of us, and it's a fairly lengthy document, so I think it would be worth having a couple of questions and then starting to move forward. Thank you. So I think actually Councillor Reid had his hand up. No, you didn't. You were just there, so it's going to be Councillor Kern then.
Cool. Thank you very much, Chair. Just a real quick one, really. I know last time we mentioned the quick chargers. One of the big issues with those is it has to be on like a connection sub point, doesn't it? It can't just be anywhere. So obviously we've got that particular location at the Winchester Hotel. Are we aware of any other locations around the Winchester city that we could maybe look at in the future just to assist those members of the taxi community yet, or is that still something that's up for having a look at?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. For a rapid charger location to be identified, it needs to effectively tap straight into an electricity substation. As you say, there is one up at the Winchester Hotel. They can install a second one in that location. We're also looking at the Tex car park, because there is an electric station on that site, with a view to putting a rapid in that location. Those are the two that I'm aware of at the moment. I mean, certainly that's a piece of work we can look at in more detail. So we'd effectively map all the substations in the city and see whether or not rapids in. But I mean, a rapid is anything that's above or 50 kilowatt hour and above charge. They are, for want of a better phrase, muscular in terms of their demand for electricity. They need power, and therefore by extension they're very expensive. So that unit cost in the £1,000. These are not cheap bits of kit to install. So it's all about keeping. It's all about ensuring that asset is going to be used. So you don't want to be ahead of the curve. It's estimated that the vast majority of people are charging at home. Like quick charge to go, so it needs to be needs to service sort of through traffic, so motorway traffic and also the taxi trade. They don't want to be sitting on a charger for anything.
So let's, if we want to start having a look through the documents sort of ahead of us, I would say obviously the key thing that we're trying to do is to look at the recommendations on page 7 of our agenda pack, but obviously the final approval of the policy will be referred to Cabinet, which is set out in the second recommendation. So I suppose I would say that, do we want to turn to the sort of key thing, the statement of the licensing policy, which is page 23, and then obviously from that we've got all of the various sections. So if we were, I mean, I think the introduction is fairly self-explanatory. I don't think there's anything there that anyone would wish to be looking at, which would take us to page 27 and Hackney vehicles. Again, I don't see any, I mean, there's almost no sort of changes on that. So I think, is there anything within that sort of section 5 on the Hackney carriages that anybody has any issues or any questions with? Oh, okay, great. So if we move to the next section, which is the private hire vehicles and operators, which takes us to, I'm going to flip through, which is page 37. Does anybody have any issues with the Hackney carriage and private? Actually, I think I flipped too far forward there, haven't I? So it's page 31. Sorry, going 6 pages too quickly. Does anybody have any sort of issues with these? Most of these, obviously, the changes within it are sort of fairly just updating and improving certain things. Oh, Councillor Pearson.
I'm not sure if it's an issue, but it's picking up something that Brian has said earlier on. He said most people are in favour. Can you define most? Because you know, that could be significant in the rural areas, because there are often no alternatives to having a taxi or a private car to take them, for example, to the doctors.
To clarify, Councillor Pearson, the proposals are to improve the safety of children and vulnerable people. There have been There's the consultation undertaken, the majority, and when I say majority is more than 51% of respondents have agreed with the recommendations. I don't consider any of the changes to affect the availability of taxis and private hires, unless anyone differently. It's more just to improve the background checks and safety of those driving them.
Sure, that's the impression I got from reading through these papers. So just picking up something that is an issue in the rural areas, because no bus service. People have, if they don't drive, and a lot of elderly people don't drive, they have to get a car hire. I've not heard of any issues, but I was worried about this definition of majority. I know 51% is a majority, or even 54% is a majority, but that leaves a raging gap, as we found out yesterday.
I think, well, I know, as you'll see, that the majority of respondents agree with the improvements to child and vulnerable adult safety. We didn't ask the question about any sort of unmet demand in this consultation. Perhaps the answers to that would be different, but that's not what we're considering in terms of this policy review.
Okay, so moving on, to have a look at these. I've got the private hire operators, section 7 on page 35. Anyone have any issues there? I think looking at it, obviously the DBS. Oh, we've got Councillor Laming.
Can I just go back a section to 6.15, door signs, taxis? I hear from taxi drivers that they think the price of those are expensive. Do we sell them to them? Make themselves?
So when we initially introduced the requirement for door signs, 2020, we gave drivers a year, maybe just more than a year, to have them installed, and we recommended to suppliers. Following feedback from the trade on the cost of those door signs, we published the specification for the door signs on the website, allowing them to go to any supplier of their choosing so that they could find a more competitive price. And it was agreed with our corporate head of service that those who had purchased door signs from the 2 approved suppliers prior to the date that we published the specification could apply for a goodwill payment, which was the balance between the average cost of a door sign from the cheapest supplier that I could find in Winchester and the price that they paid. So most drivers that have applied have received in the region of £40 to £60 goodwill payment and are now allowed to go to any supplier of their choosing. My understanding from the drivers that have had their door signs fitted recently is that they're coming out at about £25 for a pair as opposed to the previous £75.
So moving on to private hire operators, section 7. Anyone have any questions or any clarifications that they want on that section? Oh, Councillor Pearson.
Sorry, it's me again. The actual licence itself, I'm assuming we're talking about a UK licence rather than a European or Afghanistan or whatever licence.
So you mean the driving licence?
So it can be from any source?
Sorry, are you referring to the driving licence?
The driving licence, yes.
So at the moment, we can accept EU licences with certain additional checks, but otherwise, yeah, it needs to be UK or EU at the moment, and actually EU ones will be phased out to the best of my understanding.
Okay. So that was obviously the Hackney and Carriage and private driver's licences on section 8. So any, yeah, the entitlement to work. Yeah. Okay. So keep moving on. Okay. Which then gets us to section 9, Hackney Carriage and private drivers and operators criminal convictions policy on page 44. Does anyone have any comments or questions on this? Okay. Okay. Sorry, paper is fighting against me. So we then move on to the next section, which is the Hackney Carriage and private hire drivers conditions on page 57. Anyone have any questions or comments on this? No. Then we move to the section on Hackney Carriage and private hire vehicle conditions, page 63. Anyone have any questions? No. And then we move to page 73, private hire operators license conditions. Anyone got any questions or issues? So then we move on to the consideration of the Department of Transport statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards on page 79. What you had for there for a second, Councillor Kern, but no. Okay. Perfect, we'll keep going. All right then. I did actually for something myself that we did. You mentioned about the CCTV, which is on page 101 on sort of section 7.7 and 7.8. I know that it was something that as a committee, before Christmas, we had been interested and we'd looked at. And I know that you mentioned that it's something that currently we can't do. And I know that it is something that there have been issues with other authorities. And I thought that it might be worth, I know we've talked about it, I've spoken with both Dave and Bryony about it, but I thought it might be worth, as we talked about it here within the committee, to actually bring it up and actually discuss some of the issues that have happened in local authorities nearby that might be worth for us to sort of take on board, as we discuss this in the future.
So just to provide a bit of context, undertaking a CCTV review isn't just a case of we want CCTV or we don't. There's a legal requirement to establish whether it's proportionate and necessary. There's also the matter of whether it's just visual recording, video recording, or whether it's also audio recording. Most authorities will go for both, but there are different data protection issues around video and then audio recording. So in liaising with our neighbouring authority, Southampton, they had an issue with their audio recording, specifically with regards to the placement of the button that activated their audio recording. So it's not constant audio recording. I think any authority would find that quite difficult to justify as proportionate or necessary. So it is a driver activated audio recording for a set amount of time. The issue being that it was only the driver who could activate the audio recording and not the passenger. So Southampton was served with a notice from the Information Commissioner's Office advising that they may be subject to legal action. Back in 2019, they haven't received any further correspondence, but I think we can learn from that experience. And if we did decide that CCTV was proportionate and necessary to go into licensed vehicles, we would liaise with approved CCTV suppliers to understand how we can make sure that we comply with data protection law. And we'd obviously take advice from our own data protection officer at the council as well. In terms of not being able to do the review at the moment, as I said, it's not through lack of wanting to. I'd do a CCTV review tomorrow. It is a huge body of work that involves collecting crime statistics, not just from Winchester, because as we know, you can be licensed anywhere in the UK and work in Winchester, so we need to cast our net a little wider. We also need to look at complaints data, types of complaints, types of crimes, and publicly consult as well. So it's something we're committed to doing as soon as we have the resources available to do that.
Thank you, Bryony. And Councillor Pearson.
Yeah, that worries me a little bit, Bryony. I mean, there have been situations where the actual passengers have been involved in an assault, particularly when the driver is taking the victim, there's no other word for it, from the pub, reportedly home, and has been attacked on the way. I've not heard of a situation in Winchester, but certainly London, yes. So what is the delay about the obvious need for a CCTV camera? Is this government regulations not coming through, or is it something we say, well, neighbouring authority doesn't do it, so we don't do it, which doesn't make much sense to me.
So CCTV is a local decision, so it's not mandatory across the country, and that is because naturally every local area has its own context that needs to be taken into consideration. So I imagine the crime rates would be much higher in those authorities that have found CCTV to be proportionate and necessary. And I'd like to clarify that I don't believe that it isn't proportionate or necessary. It's the case that we haven't yet undertaken a transparent and open review into whether it is. And there are a lot of factors to consider in determining whether it is. I won't go in personal opinion into this, but I'm sure a lot of people would like CCTV in taxis. But to ensure that we protect ourselves legally, we need to demonstrate that it is proportionate and necessary to avoid any legal challenge.
These appendices actually does refer to this issue. So it's awareness is one thing, and actually doing something. Mind you, even George Orwell's house has a CCTV camera out, and I understand a video door button. So I think we're getting a little bit behind. I've not heard that George Orwell's home has been attacked, but nonetheless, that equipment is there. Not in taxis.
Mr. Ingram.
If I might just also add, I mean, there is the sensitivity of the fact that customers want privacy within the vehicle, so that's a matter of consideration. So capture personal conversations of using a taxi, but I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that actually it's often the taxi trade is vulnerable. They you know, a lot of people tend to focus on the clients, the customers. We are here, our primary objective is to protect public safety. I personally take the view that that's as well, because they are picking up people from time economy are respect, sailing a couple of sheets close to the wind, and the taxi trade do take a lot of abuse as well. So, you know, it is a double issue, if you like, two sides of the same coin.
I mean, I think having the chats that we've had about it, it's something that, you know, we want to get that review done as soon as possible. It is simply down to the ability to actually be able to do it, because, you know, licensing at this point just can't undertake something that isn't actually a statutory requirement, that, you know, the officers have to work to do the statutory roles and then move on to do the others. I have Councillor Kern and then Councillor Laming.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to ask, obviously I've been in a few taxis in London and locally where they have dash cams, or some already have kind of CCTV. What kind of policies do we have in place, or is there anything regarding the licensing in the sense of data protection with those drivers that wish to have it themselves? It might just be useful for everyone to understand that element to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't prohibit drivers from installing their own dash cams. Many will have them for insurance purposes. We don't prohibit them from installing their own CCTV as well. Where they install it themselves, we make them aware of the fact that they are the data controller, and we refer them to guidance issued by the Information Commissioner's Office. Whereas if we mandated CCTV, we would be the data controller. So obviously that comes with its own implications. But yes, we don't encourage it, but we also don't discourage it. So if they want to do that for their own insurance purposes, their own safety, that's fine. And then we just refer them to guidance.
Oh, Councillor Laming.
Thank you, Chair. How many instances would have helped if we'd had CCTV in there? Do you know of any?
So I can tell you that in the last financial year, which is the reporting period that I have to send over to the Department of Transport, we've had 40 complaints in relation to taxi and private hire vehicles. That's not a huge increase with regards to previous years. Complaints can vary from a driver unsafely overtook another vehicle to a driver has made inappropriate remarks to a passenger, or even more serious. In most cases, where it is a more serious complaint, it's investigated by the police, and I have no doubt that they would appreciate CCTV where it's available. What we would need to do in our CCTV review is look closely at those complaints from a set amount of years and understand whether, as you say, CCTV would have been a benefit. So I couldn't say that CCTV would have been beneficial to the investigation of all 40 of those complaints in the last year. I doubt it would have been for all of them, but that's something we'd need to look at more closely in the review.
Thank you very much. So if everyone's happy with that, we'll move on. So the next section looks at obviously the taxi policy and conditions review, the report, the summary here. I mean, obviously, I don't know if anyone's got any comments on that. I mean, it's not for us to agree or disagree with, as it's, you know, a consultation. And then that moves us over to the data protection impact assessment of that, the last section, which is page 141. So That brings us back to having gone through the document and giving it, I think, a good look through. That brings us back to page sort of 7, where we need to look at the recommendations. That the committee agree the amendments to the policy and the associated changes to the driver, vehicle and operator licensing conditions as set out in Appendix 1 of this report, and that we refer the statement of licensing policy as refers to Hackney carriage and private hire vehicles, drivers and private hire operators in Appendix 1 for consideration to the Cabinet. Are we agreed with that, those recommendations? Agreed? Okay, thank you very much.
Chair, can we just thank the officers for all the hard work to this? Made it very simple for us.
They have. Thank you very, very much. I know, and thank you for meeting with me and going through things as well, because it's really useful, because as you say, they take what is an incredibly complex and big document and make it seem very, very easy for us lay people. So that's brilliant. So thank you very much. And I will close the meeting. Get to use the gavel.